How many times? 5?
Bravo, Romeo, India, Alpha, November.
And then what? And his reaction was to do what?
It's going to be out of Florida.
He just grabbed you? Did he hit you though? I mean...
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Why were Gabby and Brian squabbling? We 11 minutes into the body cam footage and the officers are still trying to figure out what actually happened, what is going on. And the reason it's taking so long is neither of the two, neither Gabby nor Brian, are really answering the question. And we're going to see once again in this episode how frustrating and difficult it is to get a straight answer out of either of them, but especially Brian. In Deep Dive 5, we've had a couple of deep dives already. In Deep Dive 5, we are going to broach a quite tricky subject, which is one of the two, either Gabby or Brian, isn't telling the truth about something. And we're going to start trying to figure out which one is being deceptive of the couple. Over the festive season, I watched The Murder of Gabby Petito, Truth, Lies and Social Media, the documentary on Peacock, on the Peacock channel. Some of the power in a documentary is that it sweeps you up in the same incredible, breathtaking vistas that Gabby and Brian were swept up in. So you kind of get a sense of what they were feeling. And obviously when you're younger, those feelings of excitement are even greater. And I think in the context not only of these awe-inspiring landscapes, but us just having gone through Christmas and New Year, I certainly got a deeper sense of what was stressing them out. What does stress people out? Well, things like expectations, right? Going on holiday and having milestones on a particular trip is a lot like navigating Christmas and New Year with family members. You have to budget, you have to manage expectations, including your own expectations, and you have to pace yourself. There are ordinary expectations such as time loved ones expect to have with you and time you hope to have with loved ones. What happens then when, by hook or by crook, certain people close to you seem more committed or interested in someone or something else, and those expectations are not met? What happens? I think there's something about the mindset of Christmas and New Year that is similar to the mindset of an engagement or marriage for young lovers. It's supposed to be magical. It's supposed to be happy. It's supposed to all just fall into place. And so when it doesn't, it's a shock. When things go wrong, it's unsettling. There's a saying, life happens while you're making other plans. I think a lot of life was happening while Gabby and Brian were planning their trip. And one aspect that you might not think about in these spectacular, these stupendous surroundings are sort of ordinary agitating things like someone whose feet smell, whose feet are dirty, and flies buzzing around. And we're going to deal with these things that were sort of upsetting the fairy tale in this episode. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind there's a Patreon channel where we discuss Gabby Petito as well as other high-profile true crime cases. But as for this video, make sure you like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So in the documentary, The Murder of Gabby Petito, Truth, Lies and Social Media, the filmmakers highlighted a screen grab from the Moab incident, and it was this one where Gabby says, "He told me I needed to calm down." It got me thinking, Gabby did need to calm down, but why did she need calming down? Why wasn't she calm? And I think the answer is to do with Gabby and Brian not managing their expectations of themselves, of one another, of the trip. Part of managing expectations is being practical and reasonable with regard to, for example, your budget, but also with regard to your emotions. Think about, in terms of budget, on a trip like this, you've got to be careful not to live beyond your means. But not living beyond your means and having a romantic time together, especially when you're young, often feels, well, mutually incompatible. And think about Christmas celebrations that are modest or restrained or limited in some way, that are practical and reasonable under certain circumstances, versus, well, let's say the Patsy Ramsey approach to Christmas. We all want the fairy tale, the extravagant celebrations of Christmas. When it comes to enjoying ourselves, and when it doesn't turn out quite so well, how do we react? When things don't meet our expectations, how do we respond? Well, often we need to calm down. One dimension I hadn't considered while analyzing the Moab incident is Gabby's father's possible disdain for Brian and possibly undermining him, calling him Brianna, etc., and perhaps not quite approving of Brian as Gabby's husband, or Brian marrying Gabby at such a young age. And I must say, if I was Gabby's father, I'm not sure if I would have felt any differently. But if Brian worried that he wasn't good enough for Gabby, Gabby's father apparently feeling the same way may well have aggravated arguments. One can imagine in the heat of an argument, Gabby possibly saying, "My dad was right about you," or Brian saying, "You know what, you're just like your father." It would also be Gabby's job then to reassure Brian that he was good enough. But what happened when Brian made Gabby upset? And why was Gabby so upset? I think because wrapped up in the summer epic wasn't just her future with Brian, but their future. It wasn't just their relationship future that was at stake, but her work and career, and his work and career. And if you think about it, while all their family and friends are admiring them and envious of what they're doing, in reality, things are falling apart. By the time of the Moab incident, things were well and truly coming unstuck. Both of them were unraveling, but especially Gabby. I mean, think about all the whammies we're talking about here. It's not just a case of if the summer epic doesn't work, you've lost your job and you've burned through all your cash. You end up nowhere with nothing, and you've got to start all over again. And in a weird way, in the eyes of the people that have been admiring you, you are now kind of a failure. They have gone on to study at college and, start their lives, and you are kind of going backwards and starting from scratch. You're a failure before you've even started. So I think a summer epic fail likely also meant the end of their relationship, their engagement, their marriage, their life together. So again, just think about that. If the summer epic fails, it means it's the end of their relationship, their life together. But if you think that's not a big deal, you might think, so what? You can have lots of relationships. If you think that's not a big deal, losing your job and losing your soulmate back to back, it clearly was a huge deal to them. When you're that age and you lose someone that you really love, it can be absolutely devastating. And it can be quite hard to survive for some people. And, remember, both lost their livelihoods in the scheme of things. Like in hindsight, we know that both did lose their livelihoods and both lost their soulmates. And the inability to manage expectations around this appears to be why both of them ultimately lost their lives. Somebody believed being with Gabby was everything, and it was sort of almost all or nothing. It was, being without her was nothing. All or nothing, but all or nothing isn't managing expectations. Ironically, the Moab incident was about managing the expectations of the cops. Were their arguments a big deal? Were the arguments a big deal? And that's what the police wanted to know. And they would say no. Did Gabby hitting Brian really matter? No. They're managing those expectations. Did Brian grabbing or pushing Gabby really matter? Gabby and Brian seemed to convince the cops that it wasn't. It wasn't a big deal. But of course it was, wasn't it? I mean, this was a kind of final signpost before Gabby actually lost her life. So it clearly was a huge deal. So in this episode, we're going to continue the deep dive from the 11-minute mark to about the 13-minute mark. And we start where Officer Pratt says, if you know you have an anxiety, look at the situations you can get in. And I really want you to think about those words.
It may be bad for your soul. Just saying. I'm not telling you what to do with your life, but if you know you have anxiety, look at the situations you can get in. You know what I mean?
It's actually an excellent point by the officer, because the van life thing was a situation of Gabby and Brian's own making. And I wonder whether one or both of them was too proud to admit it was a failure. Within 2 weeks of this comment by Pratt, where he said, if you know you have anxiety, look at the situations you can get in, Gabby would be dead. And about 2 weeks after that, Brian would be dead. Look at the situations you can get in. At this point, at 11 minutes and 11 seconds into the body cam, Officer Pratt abruptly walks off, allowing Officer Robbins to interject.
You said you were hitting him in the arm. Did you grab the steering wheel?
No, I didn't.
You did not touch the steering wheel?
I didn't touch the steering wheel, but only for like a second, because I just saw the lights come on, and it was more just like, you're an idiot.
But did you grab the steering wheel and
No.
swerve or anything like
No.
that?
I didn't touch the steering wheel at all.
So in case you missed that, Officer Robbins says, quick question, you said you were hitting him in the arm. Did you grab the steering wheel? And Gabby's response is to sort of demonstrate what she actually did, right? And here we want to try and examine whether what Gabby says is trustworthy, whether we believe what she's saying. And we're going to do the same thing with Brian, but Gabby says, no, I didn't touch the steering wheel, and she sort of wheels around in her seat, and she says, but only for like a second, because I saw the lights come on, and it was just like, and then she demonstrates hitting. And, it's difficult to know exactly what she's saying there. What does she mean by, but only for like a second? Is she saying she only touched the steering wheel for a second, or that she only hit him for a second? What is the, but only for like a second? What does that refer to? And so if you look at these screen grabs from the body cam, she is remembering, she's gesturing to almost like a moment where she looked over her shoulder and saw the police car. And she's also gesturing how she would have, hit Brian. But she's sort of gesturing with the wrong arm. She wouldn't have been hitting with I don't think she would have been hitting with the left arm, because Brian was sitting on her right, kind of thing. But it is interesting just how emotional she is in that moment, gesturing. Even when replayed a few times, this is such a garbled response from Gabby. It's not clear what she's really saying. And so Officer Robbins repeats the question. He says, but did you grab the steering wheel? And then Gabby says, no, I didn't hit the steering wheel at all, right? And one's got to kind of almost imagine what Officer Robbins saw. The van abruptly changing direction. Why was that? Why did it abruptly change direction? Was Brian distracted? Was Brian sort of looking at Gabby and then perhaps saw the police? We know that he was speeding. What actually happened? It would be interesting to know. But I think somebody is lying. I don't think you can get away from that. Somebody isn't telling the truth. Brian said he hit the curb because Gabby grabbed the wheel. Gabby says she never touched the wheel. So which one is it? And in this episode, we're going to start approaching the question about which one of the two is less reliable, which one of the two is less than honest. So at 11 minutes 32, Officer Robbins tells Gabby is going to close the door and offers to he offers to crank up the air conditioning some more. Gabby at this point asks him if he has any water for her. Remember, August 12th was a particularly hot day in Utah. At this point, at 11:39 in the body cam, Officer Robbins approaches Brian and the van, and by this time a fourth person is on the scene, Melissa Holes. Holes is sort of a park ranger. She's the visitor and resource protection supervisor at the Arches National Park. And now would be a really good time to jump into body cam 2, just to get an idea of exactly what Brian is saying to Officer Pratt, on Pratt's body cam, and also get a sense of what Holes witnesses in her opening impressions of Brian. Because Holes does seem to get a better handle of the situation than the male officers. For the moment, though, let's stick with Officer Robbins. He actually approaches Holes and asks her if she has any water for Gabby, right? There you can see her standing on the left side there. So now we have 4 officers on scene. 1, 2, 3, and Officer Robbins. 4. And there he is approaching her, and here you can see Brian turned, talking to Officer Pratt. When Robbins approaches the 2 officers and Brian, Officer Pratt can be heard mentioning that Brian also has marks or injuries on his face. And then Pratt adds, she's got some marks on her too. Pratt then waves Brian towards Officer Robbins and says, tell him what happened. Pratt mutters to Brian something along the lines of, start from the beginning. And right here, right now, Brian's body language is worth noting. He's sort of in the fig leaf position. Both hands are covered, or closed over one another and sort of blocking the groin area, right? And it's kind of from this point onwards that Brian actually starts smiling quite a lot, right? Brian starts off by saying, start at the beginning, and he smiles, and he says, I don't want to go too far back, but then he does go quite far back, and he says, it's hard to make out exactly what he says here, but he mentions the flies being pretty intense, and that this is definitely getting to her. Now think about this whole idea of this trip that's supposed to be this dream trip, and the beautiful curated images that they're putting on Instagram. Meanwhile, the reality is dirty feet and flies that are really annoying them, right? And so he actually leans over to look at his feet as he mentions it, and he seems to think it's quite funny. But just think how annoying dirty feet can be in a van in the middle of summer, and you're sharing that cramped space with someone constantly, and also perhaps sometimes sleeping in that cramped space. If not sleeping in the van, then sleeping in a tent, but there you're still going to be dealing with a person's smelly feet, right? And Brian then says, those squabbles started because you're hanging around at the coffee shop, and then he says something about, I moved the food around. It's not actually clear what he's really talking about there. The squabble started because of exactly what? So he doesn't really answer that question. Brian's also gesturing here, and then he looks over his shoulder at Officer Holes, who is lingering nearby. He seems very worried and very vigilant about who is listening to what he's saying. And again, I'm a little bit disappointed that Officer Robbins doesn't interrupt Brian more often and challenge him and say, answer the question and be specific about this and that or whatever. He just sort of lets Brian ramble and sort of say things that he wants to say, and Officer Robbins doesn't really seem to direct the conversation and limit Brian in the sort of verbal diarrhea that's sort of coming out of him. There's also some interruption here, and then Officer Robbins asks Brian if he needs any water, and Brian perks up, thumbing behind him, right? And this part is really quite interesting, and you can listen to the original body cam if you're interested. But Brian actually says, I don't like drinking out of plastic bottles. And it sounds like they were headed to the park to get water. And you might think that this whole thing, I don't like drinking out of plastic bottles, isn't a big deal, but it actually is. On August the 20th, I think it's August the 19th, there's actually a post from Gabby where she talks about the someone leaving litter lying around, and I think there's a hashtag or something about not believing in drinking out of plastic bottles. So they both feel the same way. But Brian obviously feels a lot more strongly about it, because on this particular day, Brian refuses to accept bottled water from the officers, whereas Gabby does accept them. She actually accepts 2 bottles of water. So Gabby was obviously very thirsty on that day. But it also just shows quite a high maintenance fellow, what a high maintenance fellow Brian is. He seems quite casual and unassuming, but he's actually quite strict with regard to his view of the world, right? Well, what do you think that's like to live with? What do you think a person like that is like to travel with? What do you think that person's expectations might be of someone he's with, when he has such high standards apparently for himself? So thus far, Brian's story has actually given us a whole lot of nothing. We've learned that his dirtiness has bothered Gabby, and just think about this weird combination of he's dirty, but then he doesn't, he person is dirty, but then he doesn't want to drink out of bottled water. But, so it's, he has a certain standard of cleanliness to the environment, but what about to himself? And just looking at the optics of the body cam, Gabby looks clean and presentable, well dressed, whereas he looks dirty, sweaty, and is dressed like a slob. And one reason his feet are probably dirty is because he seems to regard it as an achievement to walk around without shoes. And one of his Facebook posts, he actually says that. Although it feels like a whole lot of nothing, and he's dancing around the matter at hand, whether he hit her or not, one thing it does show by complete chance is how picky and high maintenance he is. He's not willing to drink water out of a plastic bottle. It's very noble and fits into him being an environmentalist and all, but imagine being on a long distance trip with someone else who is thirsty while refusing to buy bottled water anywhere. Imagine how that makes life more difficult, traveling with someone who refuses to drink bottled water. It just means it's going to be more difficult to find water, potable water, right? And I think this is Brian being quite rigid and anal in his beliefs. One could argue that it's altruism or something, but in the context of a police stop on one of the hottest days, it should be days in the middle of summer, when they're on their way to get water, and then Brian is offered and he refuses it. It shows something of the kind of person Brian is, I think, quite stubborn, right? And quite bizarre in a way. Although Gabby possibly shares some of Brian's sensitivities, and I think she also feels that, as I say in that Facebook, in that Instagram post, that she's against drinking bottled water, against plastics. She clearly doesn't share his disdain for bottled water here on this day, because there she is, holding 2 bottles of water. And one wonders whether Brian gave her a hard time for a simple thing like that. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I do want you to remember a question posed in this episode. One of the 2 are lying about Gabby touching the steering wheel. In episode 6, we'll provide an important clue who that might be. So I'm not going to take it further than that. If you'd like me to do a proper review of the Peacock documentary, let me know. But something that I just want to mention quickly is there are still those people who think that there's a connection between the murdered couple, the two women who were murdered in Moab, and Gabby Petito. But the one thing that they don't seem to want to talk about is what would the motive be? And someone said that Brian was jealous if Gabby sort of hung out with her friend Rose Davis. But Rose Davis is someone that Gabby knew very well, and Rose also knew Brian. And Rose was sort of, the impression I get is that Rose was single, and Rose was perhaps tempting Gabby to meet other guys, right? Whereas in a couple scenario, where these two women are married, I don't know how Brian would feel jealous, or I just don't know how you could address anything regarding motive there. And people who want to believe, and I think that is the case, people want to believe there's some kind of connection. If you're really being honest, what would the motive be? I don't really see one. I don't really see it being the case. And I did go into their Instagram to see if I could see a Instagram post showing that they weren't in the area. After the Moab incident, they left Moab. But there is the next post on Gabby's timeline is, I think, August 19th. But it's not clear where they are in that picture. But one thing I did notice in that picture is the water bottle at the bottom left of that picture. And remember all the information that came out about that water bottle. But notice what she says in the script to the right. She talks about plastic bottles. So that was obviously an issue for both of them. And both of them are very sensitive about small things. And the question is, if you're anxious, is that going to make things worse? And are you going to be able to handle life being so sensitive to certain things? If you don't have enough water to drink on a hot day, you might say it's commendable to make the sacrifice and go thirsty. But it is also about the ability to function and to sustain yourself. And look how much longer Gabby and Brian lived after the Moab incident, not very long. And so if you're going to have these standards and be sensitive to certain things, you've got to be able to keep it up. You've got to be able to deal with anxiety and stress that comes about because of this. And so managing expectations also means managing your own expectations, your own standards. Sometimes you've got to be a little bit flexible in order to allow yourself to enjoy life and to get through a difficult period. Food for thought, I hope. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.